What happens when a racist security guard humiliates a black woman at a bank, not knowing she's the city's new police commissioner? This story will leave you speechless. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon when Commissioner Angela Rhodes walked through the glass doors of First National Bank in downtown Detroit. She was wearing a simple black blazer, dark jeans, and comfortable flats. Nothing flashy. Nothing that screamed authority or power. To anyone watching, she looked like what she was, a working woman trying to handle her banking during a busy day. Angela had been Detroit's police commissioner for exactly 3 weeks. Her appointment had made headlines across the country, the first black woman to hold the position in the city's history, a former FBI agent with 22 years of experience, and someone who'd built her reputation on community policing and police reform. But she wasn't the type to announce her presence or demand special treatment. She believed in leading by example, in showing respect to earn respect. Today, she had a simple mission: open a new business account for the police department's community outreach program. The paperwork was in her briefcase, the authorization letters were signed, and she had 30 minutes before her next meeting with the mayor. It seemed straightforward enough. The bank was busy with the usual afternoon crowd. People on lunch breaks, retirees handling their monthly banking, young professionals checking their accounts on phones while standing in line. Angela took her place behind a businessman in an expensive suit and pulled out her phone to review emails while she waited. That's when she caught the attention of Webb. Marcus was the head of security for First National, a position he'd held for 8 years. At 45, he was a big man with an even bigger attitude, someone who took his authority seriously and wasn't shy about using it. He'd been a security guard at various businesses around Detroit for over 15 years, and in his mind, he'd learned to spot trouble before it started. His philosophy was simple: keep the undesirable elements out, and the bank would run smoothly. And in Marcus's world, undesirable had a very specific definition, one that unfortunately included people who looked like Angela Rhodes. From his position near the entrance, Marcus watched Angela with growing suspicion. He didn't like what he saw: a black woman in casual clothes carrying a worn briefcase, checking her phone frequently. To him, she looked out of place among the bank's usual client. She looked like someone who might be casing the joint, someone who didn't belong in a respectable establishment like First National. Marcus had made these judgments before. He'd never been proven wrong in his own mind. The few times customers had complained about his behavior, management had always supported him. After all, security was his job, and if he had to ruffle a few feathers to keep the bank safe, so be it. He watched Angela move forward in line, noticed how she kept checking her phone, how she seemed to be observing the bank's layout. In Marcus's suspicious mind, these were all red flags. When she reached into her briefcase to pull out some papers, he'd seen enough. Marcus approached her with the swagger of someone who believed his badge gave him unlimited authority. "Excuse me, miss," he said, loud enough for other customers to hear. "Can I ask what your business is here today?" Angela looked up from her phone, surprised by the interruption. I said, "What's your business here? You've been standing in line for a while, looking around, checking your phone. Just want to make sure everything's on the up and up." Angela felt the familiar sensation she'd experienced too many times in her career, the moment when someone decided she didn't belong somewhere based purely on how she looked. But she also knew how to handle these situations professionally. "I'm here to conduct banking business just like everyone else," she said calmly. Marcus crossed his arms. "What kind of banking business?" "The personal kind," Angela replied, her tone still polite but with a slight edge. "Look, lady, I'm head of security here, and I have the right to ask questions when someone looks suspicious." The word suspicious hung in the air like a challenge. Several other customers had stopped their conversations to watch the exchange. Angela felt their stares, felt the familiar burn of humiliation that came with being singled out for no reason other than her race. "I'm not sure what about me appears suspicious," Angela said quietly. "I'm standing in line, waiting my turn, conducting myself appropriately. You keep looking around, taking pictures with your phone. I haven't taken any pictures. You keep checking your phone, looking at the layout of the bank, acting nervous." Angela took a deep breath. She could feel the situation escalating, and she had a choice to make. She could pull out her badge, end this immediately, and humiliate Marcus in front of everyone. Or she could handle this the way she handled all difficult situations, with patience, dignity, and faith that the truth would eventually win out. "Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm simply a customer waiting in line. I haven't done anything inappropriate." Marcus didn't like her tone. In his experience, people who challenged his authority were usually hiding something. "I'm going to need to see some identification." "For what purpose?" "To verify you have legitimate business here." Angela looked around the bank. No one else was being asked for identification. No one else was being questioned about their purpose. She was the only black woman in line, and she was the only one being treated like a potential criminal. "Am I being detained?" she asked, her voice still calm but with the authority of someone who knew her rights. "I'm asking you to cooperate with a security check, and I'm asking you what legal authority you have to demand identification from a customer who hasn't committed any crime or violated any policy." Marcus's face flushed red. He wasn't used to people who knew their rights, and he definitely wasn't used to being challenged by someone he assumed had no power. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but I know exactly who I am," Angela said quietly. But Marcus was on a roll now, his voice getting louder, his attitude more aggressive. "This is a respectable bank, and we don't tolerate people who come in here looking like they're up to no good. If you can't provide identification and explain your business, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The bank had gone completely quiet. Customers were openly staring now, some pulling out phones to record the encounter. The tellers had stopped their work to watch. Even the bank manager had emerged from his office to see what was causing the commotion. Angela felt the weight of every stare, the heat of every judgment. She thought about all the times she'd been in similar situations, as a young FBI agent, as a detective, as a community leader. She thought about how many times she'd had to prove she belonged somewhere, how many times she'd had to work twice as hard to earn half the respect. But she also thought about why she'd taken the job as police commissioner, not for the title or the power, but to change exactly this kind of interaction, to make sure that other people, other black women, other people of color wouldn't have to endure what she was enduring right now. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a new authority, "I'm going to give you one more opportunity to step back and allow me to conduct my business." Marcus laughed, actually laughed. "Lady, you're in no position to be making demands." "Security," he called out to his colleagues. "I need backup here." Two other security guards approached, looking uncertain about the situation but deferring to Marcus's authority. "I want her searched and her bag checked," Marcus announced. "She's been acting suspicious, asking questions, taking pictures." "I haven't taken any pictures," Angela repeated. "Don't lie to me," Marcus snapped. "I saw you with your phone." That's when Angela made her decision. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a leather credential case. She opened it slowly, deliberately, and held it out for Marcus to see. The badge was unmistakable. Detroit Police Commissioner, with the seal of the city and her photograph clearly visible. Marcus stared at the badge for a long moment, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. The other security guards stepped back instinctively. The entire bank fell into complete silence. "Commissioner Angela Rhodes," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent space. "Detroit Police Department." Marcus's face went from red to white in about 3 seconds. Didn't you should have said what?" Angela asked, slipping the badge back into her pocket. "That I have the right to exist in public spaces without being harassed? That I have the right to conduct business without being treated like a criminal? That I have the right to be judged by my actions rather than my appearance?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. But here's where this story gets really interesting. Because Angela Rhodes hadn't just been appointed police commissioner, she'd been specifically hired to address the exact kind of behavior Marcus had just displayed. The bank manager, Robert Chen, approached with obvious distress. "Commissioner Rhodes, I am deeply sorry about this incident. This is absolutely not how we treat our customers." Angela looked at him calmly. "Mr. Chen, isn't it?" We met at the Chamber of Commerce breakfast last month. Robert nodded, looking mortified. Yes, ma'am. Again, I cannot apologize enough for how you were treated. Angela looked around the bank, at all the customers still staring, still recording with their phones. She knew this incident would be online within hours, knew it would become another viral video of a black person being harassed for existing in a public space. But she also knew this was an opportunity, not for revenge, but for education. Webb, she said, turning back to Marcus, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Can you tell me what specific actions I took that made you consider me suspicious? Marcus stammered. I was standing in line, checking my phone and carrying a briefcase. Is that correct? Well, yes. And how many other customers were doing those exact same things? Marcus looked around the bank, finally noticing what should have been obvious from the beginning. Nearly everyone was on their phones, most people were carrying bags or briefcases, and several people had been looking around while waiting in line. The difference, Angela continued, is that I was doing those things while black, and in your mind that made me a threat. The silence in the bank was deafening. Marcus had no answer because they both knew she was right. Angela turned to address the entire bank. My name is Angela Rhodes, and I'm Detroit's police commissioner. 3 weeks ago, I was sworn in with a mandate to reform how law enforcement interacts with our community. Today, I experienced firsthand why that reform is necessary. She paused, letting that sink in. What happened here today wasn't about security. It was about assumptions. It was about looking at someone and deciding they don't belong based on nothing more than the color of their skin. And it happens every day. In banks, in stores, in restaurants, in places where people are just trying to live their lives. A young black woman in the crowd nodded, tears in her eyes. She knew exactly what Angela was talking about. Mr. Webb, Angela continued, you have a choice to make. You can learn from this experience, examine your biases, and commit to treating every customer with dignity and respect. Or you can continue down the path that led to this moment, and face the consequences of that choice. Marcus looked around at the watching crowd, at his colleagues, at his boss. He realized that his career, his reputation, and his future were hanging in the balance based on what he said next. Commissioner, he said slowly, I was wrong, completely wrong. I profiled you based on my own prejudices, and I'm ashamed of my behavior. Angela nodded. That's a start, Mr. Webb. But acknowledging the problem is only the first step. The real work comes in changing the behavior. She turned to Robert Chen. Mr. Chen, I'd like to suggest that First National implement bias training for all security personnel. I know some excellent programs that have shown real results in changing how people interact with diverse customers. Robert nodded eagerly. Absolutely, Commissioner. Whatever you recommend. And Mr. Webb, Angela continued, I'd like you to attend that training. Not as punishment, but as education. Because the next person you profile might not be as patient as I was. They might not have a badge to make you reconsider your action. They might just be someone trying to cash their paycheck or make a deposit, and they deserve the same respect you'd give to anyone else. Marcus nodded, still looking stunned by the turn of events. Angela looked around the bank one more time. I came here today to open an account for a police department community outreach program. The goal of that program is to build trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. Today's incident is a perfect example of why that trust needs to be rebuilt. She pulled out her briefcase and removed the paperwork she'd come to file. Now, if it's all right with everyone, I'd like to complete my banking business. I have a meeting with the mayor in 20 minutes to discuss police reform initiative. The next teller in line immediately called her over, treating her with the respect she should have received from the moment she walked in the door. As Angela completed her transaction, she could hear conversations starting around the bank. People were talking about what they'd witnessed, about their own experiences with profiling, about the need for change. But the real impact of this story was just beginning. By evening, video of the incident had been shared thousands of times on social media. The hashtag #Commissioner Rhodes was trending, with people sharing their own stories of being profiled and discriminated against in public spaces. First National Bank issued a public statement apologizing for the incident and announcing new diversity and bias training for all employees. They also established a customer relations hotline for people who experienced discrimination at any of their locations. Marcus Webb didn't lose his job, but he did something more important. He kept his word. He attended the bias training, participated actively, and began to understand how his assumptions and prejudices had affected his interactions with customers. He even volunteered to become a trainer himself, sharing his story as an example of how people could change. The community outreach program that Angela had come to set up that day became one of the most successful police reform initiatives in the country. It focused on building relationships between law enforcement and community members before problems arose, rather than only interacting during crises. 6 months later, Angela received a letter from a young black woman who had been in the bank that day. She wrote, "Commissioner, I want you to know that watching how you handled that situation with dignity and strength changed my life. I decided to go to law school because I want to fight for justice the way you did that day. Not with anger or revenge, but with intelligence and grace." That letter sat framed on Angela's desk as a reminder of why her work mattered. The incident at First National Bank became a case study in police academies and business schools across the country. Not because of the confrontation, but because of how it was resolved. It showed that change was possible when people were willing to acknowledge their mistakes, learn from them, and commit to doing better. Angela Rhodes continued her work as police commissioner, implementing reforms that reduced use of force incidents by 40% and increased community trust in law enforcement to levels not seen in decades. She became a national leader in police reform, but she never forgot the lesson from that Tuesday afternoon at the bank. Marcus Webb became an unlikely advocate for bias training, speaking at conferences and workshops about his transformation. He often began his presentations with the words, "3 years ago, I humiliated Detroit's police commissioner because I couldn't see past my own prejudices. Today, I'm here to make sure that never happens to anyone else." The real victory in this story wasn't in the moment Angela revealed her badge or in Marcus's public embarrassment. It was in what happened afterward, the training programs, the policy changes, the conversations started, and the minds changed. Because that's how real change happens. Not through confrontation or revenge, but through education, understanding, and the courage to admit when we're wrong and commit to doing better. Angela Rhodes understood something that many people in positions of power forget. True authority doesn't come from a badge or a title. It comes from using whatever power you have to make the world a little more just, a little more fair, and a little more respectful for everyone. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is show someone who's never been held accountable that their actions have consequences. Not through punishment, but through the opportunity to grow, learn, and become better than they were before. That's the real lesson of Commissioner Angela Rhodes in the day she was profiled at First National Bank. Not that power corrupts, but that true power heals. Not that people can't change, but that sometimes they need someone with courage to show them why they should. And sometimes, just sometimes, a moment of injustice becomes the catalyst for lasting change. When the right person refuses to let it pass without turning it into a teaching moment for everyone involved. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened at First National Bank that day created ripple effects that no one could have predicted. 2 years after the incident, Angela Rhodes was invited to speak at a national conference on police reform in Washington. As she stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of police chiefs, community leaders, and civil rights advocates, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. Marcus Webb sat in the third row wearing a suit instead of his security uniform, taking notes as she spoke about the importance of bias training and community engagement. After her presentation, he approached her. "Commissioner Rhodes," he said, extending his hand. "I don't know if you remember me." Angela smiled. "Of course I remember you, Marcus. How are you doing?" "Better than I deserve to be," he replied. "I wanted you to know that day changed my life. Not just because I almost lost my job, but because it made me face something about myself I'd been refusing to see." Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. I've been working with the Detroit Police Department's community outreach program for the past year, teaching bias awareness to security personnel and law enforcement officers. I tell them my story about the day I profiled Detroit's police commissioner and learned what real authority looks like. Angela nodded, genuinely impressed. That takes courage, Marcus. Admitting our mistakes publicly isn't easy. My daughter, Marcus continued, she's 16 now. She was so ashamed of me after that video went viral. But last month, she told me she was proud of the work I'm doing now. She said I went from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. He pulled out his phone and showed Angela a photo. Marcus with his daughter and a group of young people at what appeared to be a community event. This is from last weekend. I volunteer at a community center in Corktown, helping kids with their homework, teaching them about conflict resolution. These kids, some of them have been profiled by security guards, followed in stores, treated like criminals just for being young and black. I tell them my story, and I promise them I'm working to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to them. Angela felt tears in her eyes. This was why she'd chosen grace over revenge that day. This was why she'd seen potential for redemption instead of just demanding punishment. You know what the best part is? Marcus continued. 3 of these kids want to go into law enforcement now, not because they want power over people, but because they want to protect their communities. One of them, Jasmine, she's applying to the police academy next year. She says she wants to work for a police commissioner who treats everyone with dignity. Angela looked at the photo again, at the faces of young people who were learning about justice and service from someone who had once embodied the very prejudices they faced. Marcus, she said, I think you've found your calling. He nodded. I have. And I owe it to you, not just for showing me grace when I didn't deserve it, but for showing me what real leadership looks like. You could have destroyed me that day. Instead, you gave me a chance to become better. That conversation stayed with Angela as she continued her work as commissioner. She began incorporating Marcus's story into her own presentations, showing how transformation was possible when people were willing to confront their biases and do the hard work of change. The First National Bank incident became more than just a viral video. It became a blueprint for how institutions could address discrimination. Banks across the country began implementing the First National Protocol, a comprehensive approach to bias training and customer relations that had been developed in response to Angela's experience. A young black woman who had written to Angela about going to law school graduated the previous spring and was now working as a civil rights attorney. She often credited that moment in the bank with inspiring her career choice, saying that watching Commissioner Rhodes handle injustice with such grace and authority had shown her a different way to fight for change. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the countless individuals who saw the video and recognized themselves in Angela's experience. Support groups formed in cities across the country for people who had experienced racial profiling. These groups didn't just provide emotional support, they became advocates for policy change, working with local businesses and law enforcement to implement better training and accountability measures. The Detroit Police Department, under Angela's leadership, became a model for police reform nationwide. Use of force incidents dropped by 60%, community complaints fell by 75%, and public trust in law enforcement reached its highest levels in decades. Other cities began sending delegations to Detroit to study their approaches to community policing and bias training. Angela often reflected on that Tuesday afternoon at the bank and how it had crystallized everything she believed about leadership and justice. She hadn't sought out that confrontation, but when it happened, she chose to use it as a teaching moment rather than a weapon. In her final report as police commissioner, she stepped down after 6 successful years to become director of the National Police Reform Institute. Angela wrote, "Real change doesn't come from perfect people making perfect decisions. It comes from imperfect people choosing to learn from their mistakes and commit to doing better." My experience at First National Bank taught me that every moment of injustice is also an opportunity for education. Every act of prejudice can become a catalyst for understanding, and every person who has exhibited bias can become an advocate for fairness if we give them the chance to grow. Marcus Webb, now a full-time community organizer and bias training specialist, kept that quote framed in his office. Below it, he had added his own words, I was given grace when I deserved judgment, patience when I deserved anger, and a chance to change when I deserved anger, and a chance to change when I deserved anger. Now it's my job to pass that grace forward. The real victory in this story wasn't in the moment Angela revealed her badge or in the immediate consequences for Marcus. It was in the long-term transformation of individuals, institutions, and communities that followed. It proved that justice doesn't always require punishment, that teaching can be more powerful than retaliation, and that sometimes the best way to fight prejudice is to show people a better way to be human. And it all started with a black woman who chose dignity over anger, education over revenge, and hope over cynicism on a Tuesday afternoon at a downtown Detroit bank.